You know.
All right.
It's 4 o'clock, everybody.
Well, you bringing another drum company?
Right. It is 4 o'clock.
The meeting is.
Time to begin our afternoon meeting. With the city council and planning board together at 4 o'clock. We'll call it to order at that time of the city council. And I'll turn it over to the planning board.
Yes, then I call the City of Monroe Planning Board to order and turn it back over to Mayor.
Thank you very much. Item 2 is the introduction of Lisa, please.
Good evening. I'm Lisa Stywinner, Director of Planning and Development with the City of Monroe. I want to thank all of you for being here tonight. The purpose of this joint meeting is to request for Planning Board and City Council to consider a zoning map amendment request to rezone properties located with the city limits of Monroe and the extraterritorial jurisdiction, and a text amendment request to amend the Code of Ordinances to establish Chapter 157, a new Unified Development Ordinance. Planning staff is seeking a recommendation from Planning Board tonight, and that recommendation will go before City Council at their September 14th meeting, excuse me. Each of you should have received a agenda packet in the mail that includes all the documents, a hard copy of the documents for tonight's meeting. And all those agenda packet information is located online as well. It is with great excitement to bring before you the final stages of the Transform Monroe project, which is a rewrite to our Unified Development Ordinance and a zoning map update. Planning staff, with the assistance of Kimley Horn and Associates, a national planning and engineering firm, have been working to develop a new Unified Development Ordinance and update our zoning map over the last several years. Kelly Klepper and Helen Shuda is here tonight with Kimley Horn and Associates. And we do have Corner Sproul, a leading law firm in North Carolina, has provided the city legal assistance in performing the review for the new UDO. And Nick Tosco is here with Corner Sproul in the back. This project has been a massive undertaking for the planning division, and it's been one of our top strategic goals for over the last 10 years. And I want to thank City Council and board members for the funding and the opportunity, and the management for supporting our goal to come to a reality. And of course, thank planning staff and the consultants for all the years of hard work and time spent, and as well as thank the members of our community that did attend one of the 4 public open house workshops, either participated in a stakeholder interview, or just simply followed the project on the Transform Monroe website throughout the process. Just to go over some background history of the project, and then I'll eventually turn it over to Kimley Horn and Associates to make a presentation. The purpose of this project is to develop a clear and user-friendly UDO that is consistent with the city's plans and policies and implements the relevant goals and recommendations that came out of the Ford Monroe, the update to our land use plan that was adopted in 2018. Ford Monroe, the land use plan, was designed as the city's blueprint for development, its growth strategy, and the foundation upon which future land use decisions were based, and prepares the community to accommodate future growth. Ford Monroe also included an action plan that provided a broad set of recommendations that provided additional detail in phases, responsibility, cost, and funding sources, and that provides guidance to staff in implementing the land use plan. That action plan in the Ford Monroe recommends approximately 6 short-term 2 to 5 year action items that relate to the rewrite of the Unified Development Ordinance and the zoning map update. I'm not going to go over all those 6 action items, but I did want to mention one action item, which is to complete the Transform Monroe project, rewrite our Unified Development Ordinance, as well as update our zoning map to codify and adopt zoning standards that assist in implementing our future land use plan. The new UDO and zoning map update does fulfill this action and serves as the most important implementation strategy for our land use plan. City of Monroe's current UDO and zoning map dates back to 2003, so it does not reflect the best zoning and planning practices. And with the adoption of Ford Monroe, the existence of some other adopted plans like the Concord Avenue and the Downtown Master Plan, and changes in the demographics and development patterns, the city recognized the need to update our ordinances as well as our zoning map. And as I mentioned, it is the main tool to implement the land use plan, respond to community values and goals and policies and strategies that were identified in the land use plan. As mentioned before, planning staff and Kimley Horn Associates have been working to develop the UDO and update the zoning map, and there were specific goals that we were aiming to accomplish. One was to provide a more predictable set of land use regulations for the community, developers, city officials as ourselves, by increasing the reliance on provisions of the ordinance instead of special legislative approvals. I'm not going to go over all the goals. We wanted to also update the format and the structure to be more user-friendly, provide some graphics and illustrations within the ordinance, and then of course incorporate new and innovative zoning and land development strategies. The Transform Monroe is the city's new UDO and is a consolidated document that contains all the land use and development requirements. It does implement the land use plan and other small area redevelopment plans, as well as the downtown master plan. And it does address the recent amendments to the state's planning laws, as you've heard referred to as Chapter 160D. The new UDO and zoning map update applies to all the land, once again, within the city limits and the extraterritorial jurisdiction. And the zoning map update proposes to rezone all land located within those same boundaries and establish various zoning districts. Throughout the Transform Monroe process, planning staff and Kimley Horn have held 4 joint planning board and city council meetings to present all proposed zoning ordinance sections and the zoning districts, answer questions, and receive any feedback and input. There's also been 4 public open house workshops that were held in various areas of the city. Purpose of those workshops were to discuss the proposed ordinance sections, rezonings, as well as receive input from the public. And just to mention, we did mail a postcard inviting everyone, all properties within the city, to those workshops. So there was over like 10,000 postcards that went out in the mail. There has been a project website that was created called Transform Monroe that has all the documents, ordinance sections, maps. That website was on that postcard too. So if the public weren't able to come to a workshop, they were able to go access the website, look at all the documents. And there was also a tab that you could even submit a comment on any of the information. Just want to take the opportunity to point out one very important message to the board and council. Although we have been working very hard over the years to develop a new unified development ordinance, we have the consultants, the legal team reviewing, staff reviewing. We realized that we will probably be back before, if adopted, of course, we'll probably be back before planning board and council within the next 6 months or so with an amendment, because we're not going to get it right completely the first time. The only way we're going to really know if all the ordinance sections are working properly is when we start to utilize the ordinance. So, we will be back for ordinance amendments. I believe that is all I have at this moment. I'll turn it on to Kelly Klepper to do his presentation. I need that keyboard, man. Or maybe just this mouse. You might just need a mouse.
So good evening, Mayor, council members, planning board members. For the record, Kelly Klepper with Kimley Horn. I do want to start off by saying that this has been a total team effort. You've got an incredible staff. We've been, like I said, working with Lisa, Carrie, and Doug for the better part of two plus years. A huge shout out to the city's legal team and also to Nick and the outside legal counsel. What you have before you tonight, like I said, there again is a aggregation of those thoughts, those ideas, plus listening to this group throughout our various workshops. I know we've got quite a bit of information. If you've had a chance to read the proposed UDO, you'll know that there is pretty much a drastic change or series of changes that were proposed as part of this. As Lisa said, the last time that there was a major overhaul, it's been almost 18 years. There's been a lot that has changed since that time. So when we were first tasked with identifying what is and what should, we started with Forward Monroe. We started with the land use plan that the city adopted and approved. And it's kind of set the vision moving forward for what does the city want to be in the next 5, 10, 20 years. And then we started looking at what's going on with the current UDO as it stands. Now, I will tell you that there again, we could spend an entire week going through all this information. We're going to try to go through almost 500 pages of code in the course of about an hour. So there's going to be a lot of high-level discussion. I do want to encourage questions, thoughts, even ideas as far as did you think about this? Whatever I can't answer, of course, Lisa and the team are here to answer, and also the legal consultants. But we are going to try to go through every component of this and at least get you in the ballpark as far as information. So once we kind of start talking about that, there again, Transform Monroe, that's the city's proposed UDO. As Lisa said, it's a total update of not only the current UDO, but also the zoning map. You're going to hear us use a lot of terms, a lot of acronyms, and I apologize that some of that may slip out from time to time. So if I start to see some questionable looks, we'll say from this much of the face, I will try to do my best. If not, just raise your hand and we'll try to make sure we address those questions. The other thing, especially for the folks that are towards the back of the room, if you cannot hear me, just do one of these numbers and I'll be happy to elevate the voice a little bit. And we'll go from there. But there again, as Lisa said, at the end of the night, we're asking for a recommendation to move this forward to the council for your September hearing. So a couple of things. We're going to go section by section, but we wanted to give you an overall kind of introduction of what is Transform Monroe. And of course, it is the application and the implementation of Forward Monroe, which was your long-range plan. This, as Lisa said, was a priority moving forward. And there was a couple of things that we wanted to make sure to point out as part of this UDO that we had to take into consideration because, the comprehensive plan, that Forward Monroe plan sets the stage. Your UDO and all of your standards, your regulations, your plans, whatever, are supposed to be consistent with and based off of that comprehensive plan. So, this is a dynamic, growing area, no doubt about it. Charlotte metro area is one of the fastest growing areas in the country. There's a reason. So no matter what you do here, it's going to affect and vice versa with other communities. And as Lisa said, a couple of things that kind of happened along the way. Yes, we had 160D come into play officially, which kind of, caused us to morph and move a few things. But then that dreaded COVID kind of put us off schedule a little bit. Otherwise, we'd have been done with this several months ago. So just kind of a basic about what is zoning. And I know some of this may seem very elementary to you, but zoning is just what it sounds like. It's a very basic tool in that we are looking at land uses. We're looking at design and development standards. We're identifying properties within the city and within that extraterritorial jurisdiction, that ETJ, on a map. We're color coding that map to say this is what this means. And then within the UDO, this is how that gets interpreted and defined. Within each of those districts, within each component of the UDO, we get into things like density, setbacks, building heights, open spaces, parking, signage, design standards, subdivision and development standards. There is a whole lot of information that goes on as part of this UDO, which is in essence the zoning code. That becomes, there again, where the rubber is hitting the road for this. So there again, we've got a series of items that we're going to be going through. And to kind of give you a quick update on where we are. Of course, this is very rudimentary, but kind of says everything that we did. We started with the foundations. We reviewed the land use plan. We did an analysis or a diagnostic of the current UDO. We interviewed staff. We talked to a lot of different people. And then we started getting into the UDO development. Then we started working with the legal team to refine certain aspects of it. And there again, their input has been invaluable throughout this entire process. And so we are in between step 3 and step 4. Step 4 being, of course, the ultimate adoption. So what is the proposed UDO? Well, this is a very quick snapshot on the left of the existing UDO and all of the sections that you have. Right now, you have 18 sections of your UDO. What we're proposing to do is to refine, to morph, to kind of clarify, move like terms and like items where they need to be, but moving it into a maximum of 11 sections. Now, some people may say, or start to question, did you lose anything? And the answer to that is no. It's been moved, it's been morphed, it's been put into other things. And just to kind of give you an idea, section 15 in your current UDO deals with parking. So we started asking those kind of questions along the way. Why is parking in its own section? Why not under a design development standard? So we actually started moving those types of things under section 8 of the code. So when you start looking at what's on the right, which is the proposed, I'll say the big ticket items are those sections 4, 5, 7, and 8. That being the traditional districts, your mixed use districts, your uses and standards in 7, and then also those supplemental regulations. I'm not saying that there's anything that's not important in the UDO, but just to kind of give you an idea. Some people have already been asking us, well, what were the major changes? This pretty much says what it says it needs to say. We went through, we looked at a lot of things. We looked at the parking codes. We looked at the signage standards. A lot of that was kind of, well, it's there, but, or it's so old that it really doesn't function anymore. So you'll start to see as you're looking through the UDO, the creation of the mixed use districts, which actually goes back to forward Monroe, parking standards, signage, all the way through, including use definitions, and of course being 160D compliant. And as Lisa said, there was a big focus on graphics with this. When we are sitting there as professional staff and we're questioning each other on what does this actually mean, but a picture is worth 1,000 words. Why not be able to visually or graphically illustrate the term that we're talking about so everybody can look at that and go, now I get it. Because some of this of what we're doing is pretty complex. So of course, 160D came along. I'm not going to dwell a lot on this, but there's some things that kind of came out of that with, the ability for the city to use form-based code districts. So there's design and development oriented components. There were administrative approvals that were done as, minor amendments and not necessarily like variants, permit links for the various types of applications. There's vesting rights and some other things that are put into there. And of course, it also got into starting to eliminate and combine certain portions of the general statutes, which was actually in 2 different components of the statutes. So they unified it, made it one big thing, and they started kind of putting some different pieces together. Of course, along the way, they also said that, you're not allowed as a city to regulate certain things unless it's done as a conditional district. So in essence, by agreement by all parties. So some of those things are still the same, but they did get kind of amended along the way. Now, I will definitely tell you that as we're going through this, I'm not going to dwell on portions of the UDO like section 1. That's the introduction. This is basically the who, what, when, where, and why of the UDO. Establishes the authority. It says what we're doing and why. And it also kind of says, here's what's going to happen in these transitional times where we're going from the existing UDO to the new one. How do we kind of deal with that? So this is kind of that, I'm not going to say the VCR instructions, but this is just, the very basics, what it is, why we're doing it, and what it does it include. Section 2 is that relationship to Forward Monroe, that the comprehensive land use plan that the city adopted, what was it, Lisa, 2018? I believe it was, so almost 3 years ago. And there again, we're showing how it relates back to and ties between the 2 documents, which is very important. Section 3, this is one of the bigger sections we have, and I will say this is probably the one that we're still kind of working through, especially with input from the legal team. But this is the administration. This is the one that sets out the different review bodies, whether it's the planning board versus the city council versus historic versus board of adjustments, whoever, and starts to identify the various processes that you have, whether it's a land use amendment, a rezoning, a text amendment, a variance. So who gets to do what at what stage of the game? So there again, all of that is laid out under section 3. And when you start looking in the main UDO itself, we actually call out each individual type of process that the city has with a kind of small flow chart that explains what is the step-by-step process, who's ultimately reviewing and making a recommendation, and who actually has the authority or the approval and or ultimate denial, and what happens if those get appealed at a certain point. So all of that is in section 3. There again, there's a lot of information that's in that. It's probably less relevant to when I'll say the major development community outside of the fact these are the different processes that we have. and how they're going to go about it. This also gives staff the, I'll say, the roadmap to say, okay, we're doing a rezoning. Here's the steps you need to follow, Mr. Property Owner. And here's what you can expect from a process standpoint. So we're trying to be very clear on how that is kind of laid out. A lot of this goes back to some of the general standards as far as the statutory regulations, as far as who can do what. But we try to make sure we're incorporating those within this portion of the UDO. Section 4, this is the first of the major sections, I'll call it. So this is where we are doing what we call our traditional zoning districts. So what you're going to see within every section is there's the introduction. What does that section mean? What's it doing? What's included within that? So it kind of gives you that Reader's Digest version right up front. And then once you start to kind of get into the traditional districts, this is what was formerly the R40 or the R20 districts, or the general business and the industrial district that you had. So this does not get into the mixed use. Mixed use comes with a different component. But what we started to do was to actually say, okay, the traditional districts are just that. They're traditional. There are certain types of uses. There are certain things that you can do by right. We're not going to change that. We may change some of the nomenclature with this. So we did go through and start to identify what we call use groups. So those broader categories, kind of like an umbrella for residential. And all the residential districts that we identified as part of the UDO are now in that one section instead of kind of scattered throughout. So when you start kind of looking at the different use groups, you can see those on the screen. We've got the residential, commercial, industrial plan, and we still maintain the conditional. That needs to remain in there. But what you'll start to see are what we have identified as a couple of new traditional districts. One of the things that we talked about with staff early on was, how is your general business district working? You have one commercial district in essence, and it doesn't matter if it's on Independence or it's further off the beaten path. We said, what happens if you've got that mom and pop, that smaller commercial? I mean, they're at the same design and development standards as a Target. And that's in a neighborhood type setting. So we said, let us create a new district that's a little bit more compatible with the surrounding neighborhood. So it's smaller scale and kind of, blends in better. So we identify and are proposing a new district called the neighborhood district, neighborhood business. Similarly, we talked with staff as far as industrial. And again, it was one size fits all. And what we realized is, an Amazon distribution is not the same as a rock quarry or as a processing plant. But yet your UDO did just that. So we said, let's break it out and make it a little different, just so there are some different areas where we can be a little bit, have some additional compatibility. And then, of course, adding the two new planned districts, being planned commercial and planned unit development. There again, those are still kind of falling within that traditional component itself. Now, this is where we start to kind of change up some of the way that you've done things. A lot of places, of course, use R40 or R20 or R10, and that's basically saying it's a residential and that's the minimum lot size. But you have to start going, okay, well, what is that from a density perspective? And some places do it by density, some do it by lot size. We're more accustomed to, and a lot of the municipalities that we work with are more accustomed to looking at a density standard and then applying standards from there. So what we said was, well, let's convert R40 and R20 to a proposed residential low density designation. Let's take the R10, which was your higher density, and make that to residential medium. Now, when we did all of this, we pretty much kept the densities exactly where they were. We did not take away density. We did not take away property rights or uses. If we did anything, we made it a little bit more flexible for those properties because we did not want to get into that other type of issue. So this is very similar as far as a one-for-one swap of existing districts to the new districts. And we did that for the commercial as well as the industrial. You can kind of see how those laid out. So all of those that were in there have been converted or being proposed to be converted to the districts that you see here. And we can actually go through some of those if the group would like to. From a mixed use perspective, this is where we really, I'll say, introduce something brand new for the city. We started looking at Fort Monroe, and there was a lot of discussion about a mix of uses, whether it's a vertical or a horizontal integration of uses. It's residential, it's commercial, it's office, it's in these confined settings, it's pedestrian oriented. So as soon as we start hearing all of that, we start saying that really is more like a form-based code. But to a lot of places, a form-based code is a four-letter word. So we prefer to say it's a mixed use code. Sounds a lot better because form-based code has a certain connotation. It's got a certain set of standards. You know, it actually kind of, for a lot of these places, form-based code takes away the zoning aspects of it, and it's based off of the use as far as a building is concerned. And as you know, for the certain type of building as defined is how it relates to the street. Well, we retained, we'll say, more of a hybrid approach because we know the staff and the city did not want to give up all of those rights. So there's still that zoning aspect, there's still the standards aspect, but we've married it up with some design standards, those integration of uses, and more importantly, where we need to, flexibility in the way we're approaching this. One of the things that we identified, and I think some of you heard me say this quite a few times, is one size does not fit all. And that goes for a code, to a standard, to a development. Most UDOs that we come across and we work with, one size fits all. And I always like to use the example. What's the difference between a McDonald's, a Chick-fil-A, a Subway, and a Panera? Well, let's throw out Panera, that's a little bit different. Well, we all know Chick-fil-A has a lot of traffic, and I mean, they should actually probably have been doing some of the COVID rollouts the way their efficiency rolls through with the drive-throughs. But it's completely different than a McDonald's, and it's very much different than a Subway. But yet our codes treated them the exact same no matter what. So we said, we realized Burger King and McDonald's do not park the same. Why hold the same standard? Let's provide a range of options that the city is comfortable with, and what we identified as minimums and maximums that say, okay, as long as you're within this range and this range, whether it's parking, setbacks, and some of the other standards, just keep going. There shouldn't have to be a variance or a special approval for somebody to apply a different parking standard just because they don't meet the current one that's adopted. Now, we've also built in a process to where, you know, parking, of course, is a big one that it fluctuates a lot. We didn't want to hamstring the city into saying there's only this range. We still provide the ability for an applicant, for a developer or whatever to come through with what we call an alternative parking plan. So basically, if they've done this same type of project in another community and they can provide that information to staff saying, we only need X number of parking spaces, and here's the 3 examples exactly where we've done it and how it works, that gives the staff the ability to make an informed decision, especially for the planning board at that point. So there again, the flexibility both as by right as well as the process moving forward. So we'll kind of go through some of these districts. And I know that this map is a little difficult to see. That's the reason I know Carrie passed out some 11x17s. And if we still need to, of course, I don't know if we can have the ability to pull up a separate screen on this or not, Lisa, but we can talk about each of these districts, and I'll try to give you some landmarks as we're going through. So what we did is similar to the traditional, we created use groups. We did a downtown, we did the neighborhood, we did regional, and of course, we also did the medical. And those are consistent with Fort Monroe. So each district has a different set of standards, different set of measurements, different set of flexibility components built into that. So the first one we did was we actually took what was in the CBD, that central business district, and one of the other kind of zoning districts right around the downtown. And we created what's called the mixed use zoning district, the downtown districts. And there are 2 of those. There's the core and the gateway. And what you'll start to see, of course, is if you're looking at, if you've got your full code, on, I think it's page 5-7. So that's section 5 of the UDO. Page 7, there's a blow up of the map, and it'll actually kind of show you the confines and boundaries of the gateway versus the downtown district itself. To kind of give you an idea and a feel of the flavor of it. So, you know, the downtown central allows 3 stories by right, 5 through mixed use incentives. The same thing with the mixed use gateway. And what we're trying to do is they're going to create a by right versus incentive based, so that, you know, if somebody does want to do something a little different, here's what the city gets in return for that. So it's kind of a trade-off of sorts. You'll start to see building placement, and you'll see minimum and maximum 0 or 20. Now, that's a little different than what we typically do, which is a setback of, we'll say, 20 feet from the back of the right of way. But in this concentrated downtown area, we want the buildings to be closer to the sidewalk. So that's the reason we say buildings can be anywhere between 0 to 5 or 0 to 20, depending on what they are, because we want the buildings up close on the main street or on those roads. We want the parking in the rear or the sides. In a lot of cases, what we've actually done is either modify the parking or waive the ability to require parking in the downtown area, because you've got a lot of on-street or public parking already in place. And that just becomes, I'm not going to say wasted space, but it's not, it will say income producing land at that point. So that's the reason we started looking at these types of districts. Whenever you see some of these, you'll start to see a little bit of a step down depending on where it is. So of course the downtown central is more, I'll say, compact, more condensed. Once you start to get to the gateway, it starts to kind of loosen up just a little bit. You get a little bit more flexibility there. Again, realizing that there's existing businesses and things that are already kind of working there. So then we go to our community corridor mixed use number 1. And this is the most intensive of the commercial core districts. And these are the areas in and around 74 and Rocky River, as well as Dickerson. So you can think about where those are in relationship to the city, and that's kind of your highest intense areas for development, or where we identify where we want to see increased levels of development. And that's actually on pages 5-11 and subsequent beyond that. So very similar what we're saying there, because we envision that we're going to see hotels, we're going to see a little bit taller buildings, or we're going to see a few things. It's a maximum of 4 stories. You can do certain things if it's closer to 74 at that point. There's also an integration or the ability to do some residential as part of this, because there we want to try to encourage that pedestrian compact mixed use component. And there again, we've got the building placement, we've got provisions for the understanding of parking, we've got shared parking provisions. This is another one of those where there's usually some offset in the use or the hours between, we'll say, a restaurant and an office or a residential component, to where that one parking space is going to get turned over multiple times in a day. So why do we require 3 parking spaces for those each individual use? Let's allow that to kind of work its own way out. And there again, we're not saying that this has to occur, but we're giving the ability so that the development community can maximize the land, which in turn is an increase in the tax base back to the city. So then we get into a little bit of a step down, which is the mixed use 2 district. This is primarily around the Expressway and Morgan Mill and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Washington. So there again, still fairly intense, still trying to get that mixed use component, but it's a little bit more of a step down version. So what we're trying to do there is still allow for that mixed use component where it's vertical or horizontal, a little bit shorter on the buildings. We're saying 3 stories at that point. A little bit more flexibility on where you can put the building and how, and especially with respect to the parking, but then also still having some incentives, still having requirements for open space, and still having architectural design standards. And we'll get into those in just a little bit. So we get into the regional corridor. And these are actually the more intensive of the regional corridors. This is along Rocky River and the Expressway, as well as around 601 and the Expressway. And that's starting on pages 5-23 in your UDO. So again, we've got, it's very similar to that corridor mixed use 1, in that we've got a maximum stories of about 5. We are allowing a little bit or encouraging additional residential density at these locations. But we also realize this may be a little bit more, when I say a suburban development pattern, but we're trying to encourage the urban out in those areas. So try to give a little bit more flexibility. And a lot of the same standards still apply here, whether it's shared parking, open space provisions, all the way through those components. And then last but not least, the mixed use district, the medical district, is in and around the hospital. So of course that's Roosevelt, Franklin, and Pageland. This is intended to be more of a, I'll say, kind of a hospital, medical campus, could even be an educational component to it. One of the things that we talked about and we're starting to see are the teaching hospitals. Where do those students live? Most of the zoning codes that we work with or come across do not allow the residential as part of something like that. So we wanted to make some provisions for those types of uses on a campus style setting. So there again, mixed use, but with more of a medical focus. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the overlays just because one, a lot of the overlay components are regulated by the state statutes. The other thing is, we did not modify the boundaries of like the floodplain or the floodway, the historic district, and more importantly, the airport. A lot of those are controlled by entities or like I said, state provisions that are above and beyond the city. We did update language. We did updates in terminology, working with the city staff as well as the legal team. So very good. I'm not going to spend a lot of time other than to say we retained those. We did update them from a terminology standpoint, put them into a little bit more of a consistent format with what we're proposing as part of this UDO. Section 7. So this is one of the uses in the standards. So this is where we start to identify the tables that says, here's your district, here's what you can do in that district and how we define that specific use. One of the things that we did talking with Lisa and the staff early on was, is there a quick, easy reference to say, here's your district and what you can do? And it was like, well, kinda. And it's no fault of staff. You got a great staff. And I'm going to say this right now, even though it's not budget season, understaffed staff that has a lot on their plate. And this is just one of those things that, if you can get around to it, great. But it's usually not a priority because you've got site development plans, you've got subdivisions, you got rezonings, you got everything else you got to do on a daily basis. So what we've done is to go through the list of permitted, prohibited uses that the city had. We started looking at what's kind of the best planning practices approach. We simplified the table. We looked at it by groups. There again, those residential, commercial, industrial groups. So you'll start to see some of these, I'll say, continued themes throughout with use groups and the districts. And you'll see this table repeated once we get into the parking standards as well. And then at the end of this, we also added a cross-reference to a portion of this section that gets into what we call a use definition with additional standards. So that way, as the city staff is starting to look at, well, what does this type of use actually entail? If the question comes up, there's now a list that kind of, it gives staff the guidance to say, okay, if you're doing a, I would say drive-through, whatever, or a drive-through bank, it's very clear on what that actually entails. Or if it is some form of residential or whatever, it's very clearly laid out now as far as how is that being defined by this code, by this UDO, and how is it going to be applied moving forward. I will say that we do have a couple of quick typos in the main UDO. We caught one heading, but we missed the others. What you'll see is, if there's a P, that means that specific use is permitted. If it's S, it's a special use. If it's an X, it's prohibited. Anything that is not listed, there is a provision in the UDO that says, okay, staff is going to apply, these types of standards to identify what is the closest use at that point and determine the district. So every use that we've identified, whether it's in the residential or commercial, is listed out and it's identified by district, which a traditional and or a mixed use. And then there again, at the very far end of this, you'll see those references to another section of this UDO that says, here's what it means, and here's some of the additional standards that go with it. Before I get into section 8, I know I've gone through a lot of information in a very quick period of time. I wanted to see if there were any questions from either the council or the planning board on these first 7. If that's appropriate. Sorry, I guess I should have asked. Silence is golden. We'll keep going. Okay, section 8. This is where we moved a lot of your design development standards. So there again, it's under one section. You can see that there are 10 components of this now. So yes, we did add some things to it. We did move some things around. but we put anything that was, we'll say, design and development related under one portion of the UDO. Why? There again, it's kind of like we talked about earlier. Why was parking in its own section? Didn't need to be. It needs to be a development related item. So we said, what else goes with that? So that's your subdivision regulations, your sign standards, landscaping, buffering, fences and walls, and that's a big one that we'll definitely be talking about. Parking. I'm going to gloss over the electronic gaming and the adult establishments. I think those are pretty much self-explanatory and or defined by the state. Then we get into our design standards, and we do have the optional residential as well as multifamily. We also have commercial and industrial design standards. So what we've identified there, and we'll talk about it a little bit, is what is the look and feel of that building now? What are some things that go on within that parking lot? Of course, section 8.8 is a new one where we talk about open space standards, lighting, and then 8.10 is really kind of that. So what are we talking about? How do we measure it? When we're talking about setbacks, when we're talking about build to lines or our transparency, how are we defining and measuring those? So we put those definitions and the graphics that support that right there in the same portion of the UDO. So 8.1, subdivision regulations, gets into your block standards, it gets into lots, connectivity, utilities, conservation standards. That's also your typical run-of-the-mill standards for subdivision and those types of regulations. Now, signage, on the other hand, this one is always one of those that can get very, very tricky. And I would say that the legal team will be very involved with to make sure that, one, nothing we've identified is content-based. Because if you get really, really bored, there is a Supreme Court case out there called Reed versus Town of Gilbert. Interesting reading, but basically it set the stage at the U.S. Supreme Court level for all signage standards moving forward. So we had to be very careful about, what we used to be able to say was a real estate sign and a temporary sign or a sign associated with a church or a religious organization. We had to make sure and take the content out of that and just call them different types of signs. And what you'll see here is we went from those types of signs to being, what is a wall sign? What's a window sign? Projecting, monument, sidewalk, all the way through each of those districts. Not one time in there will you see anything that says, okay, this church can only have this type of sign, or it's this in a school. Although schools, we did actually have some, one of the things we did incorporate in there is in this with respect to the digital signs. But what we said was, okay, we're going to define the sign type. We're going to tell you what the typical signs are going to look like, how they need to be placed. We're going to tell you which districts they can be in. So that way it's a district-based versus a use or content-based. And then we also start to identify, specifics as it relates to things like this. Now, of course, this is not regulatory, but we've identified this in the UDO just so somebody understands what we're talking about. What is a tenant sign versus a projecting sign versus a wall sign? And that just, there again, we're trying to create something that's easy to read and understand. And when you look at the specifics in section 8.2, we do get into the height. We get into the size as far as the face area. We get into, placement as far as on the walls or things like that. And, those types of size and placement components. Each of the signs that we defined has a specific set of standards attached to it. And then also within that, we say how many signs can a specific property or a group of properties have. All of that is defined in the new UDO. One of the things that staff asked us to make sure we included was this, section 8.3, which was the landscaping, buffering, fences, and walls. Seems pretty mundane, seems pretty boring, but this is probably one of the most important things that you're going to hear about. Everything is important because this is what we're talking about in between uses, and not necessarily uses, but the districts themselves. So what's being installed or required to be installed between a commercial and a residential district from a buffering standpoint. Now, we always see, I think we're all used to seeing, we'll say it's a 25-foot buffer with 3 trees per 100 and something else. Or if there's a wall, the wall is this plus the trees. But what the UDOs typically don't do is to say, where is that wall actually installed? Which side are the trees? Are they on the private side or the public side? So what we said was when we're defining this, that, we're all looking at we'll say from the public realm, so that edge of the sidewalk into the property. So you're looking at this ground cover, you're looking at the smaller trees, you're looking at the canopy trees, and then the wall. They can continue to do as much landscaping as they want to on the other side of the wall, but from the city's perspective, we want to make sure that what is the outward appearance is what the city wants, not what that individual resident is going to be looking at. So we wanted to make sure, there again, that outward appearance, what is that public look? So all of the standards are reflected from the edge of the right of way back into the property. So one of the things that we did, of course, was to provide these types of graphics where we're saying, you know, if you're going to have a berm, typically it's a 5-foot berm. If there's going to be a wall, it's a maximum of 8 feet. We do get into materials. We get into numbers of trees per 100 feet along that frontage. And one of the things we also do is allow flexibility in the landscape design. Why? Because we know that utilities, driveways get in the way, signs get in the way. And we also don't what we like to refer to as that row of 10 soldiers, that you have a tree every 20 feet. It looks nicer, it looks better, it's more attractive if you allow some form of grouping of trees to where it's a little bit more natural fill. You still have some gaps, but it's still the same basic number of trees. Consistent with what we've talked about from a parking and signage with the flexibility of some of our build to lines, we did the same thing with the landscaping. There again, realization is not every property is going to be exactly the same. So if you're required to have a type 2 buffer, which we define based off of certain types of uses adjacent to each other, then you know it's a 10-foot wide and there's a certain number of trees, whether it's option 1, 2, or 3. Now there are trade-offs to where if it's less trees, then you're providing more of something else. So you start to see some of these components, and we start off as low as 7.5 feet, and we go as high as 50 feet. Of course, the 50-foot buffers are typically for, we'll say like your industrial up against residential or some of your office settings. And they're all defined within the UDO as far as which type of buffer is required in between those uses. And I will say that, you know, some people will start to ask, well, how do we know who has to put it in? And, you know, last one in, guess what? They're the ones that are looking at having to do the buffers, unfortunately. You know, you've got an existing residential neighborhood, you've got a commercial development coming in. It's not going to be required of that residential neighborhood to provide the buffer. Instead, it's the commercial property that's required to do the buffer to you know, from a compatibility standpoint with the residential neighborhood. So there again, each of the 5 types is defined. It's identified through graphics so that you're looking at 3 different views, so that there's no confusion as to what we're talking about and how we are talking about it. Everything from, like there again, the adjacent property or the property line coming in towards the private property itself. So parking, this was one of those that we definitely went and got a little creative. Similar to some of the other things, we did minimum and maximum parking standards like we talked about. We also identified parking area design so that there's a certain amount of landscaping or connectivity between the parking areas and the buildings, or, you know, as we're talking about drive aisles or the width of parking spaces, that it's very clearly identified what we mean and how we want those designed moving forward. All of that is under section 8.4, including the table, which identifies there again, those minimums and maximums, just allowing for that flexibility for somebody to be able to come in with a range and working from there. And there again, we did build into this the alternative parking plan, or that APP, that allows for variations based off of new and updated parking standards. And I will say parking standards is kind of like trip generation. It's always evolving to where the parking that is required today for a restaurant is not going to be the same in the next 3 years. We know that. That's part of the reason we also look at doing this flexibility components. 8.7, this actually gets into, like I said, the design standards, whether it's a residential, which of course is optional, the multifamily, commercial, or industrial. So we're looking at design elements of buildings. We're looking at the facades. We're looking at transparency. We're looking at the orientation of the buildings. we're looking at accessory structures. We're looking at a lot of different things that, come into play from a building standpoint. So, we've added, I will say within the industrial, we didn't want to have the same standards that you would normally see, we'll say like with a commercial component, but there's still foundation plantings. There's still some level of building design. So there's not just a blank wall that's 200 feet long. There's some articulation, there's some elevation changes. A lot of times people will refer to those as big box standards. If you look at, and I just went blank on the place in Colorado, Fort Collins is probably one of the first places that implemented design standards for big boxes. And it was to break up the facades and just to take the normal box that we all know and love and make it a little bit more interesting, make it a little bit more unique, make it to where it's not all of the parkings in the front, that we're distributing the parking. And it's actually, it's an aesthetically pleasing building and development. So there again, just as we've identified in this, we're talking about the finished floors, we're talking about transparency, so the amount of windows or transparent features that are required. That's all within this section. And then a new section that we've also identified, or actually it's not necessarily all new, but section 8.8, which are our designs for open spaces. We do have a tiered approach. And one of the things that we talked about with staff in looking at some of your site plans was, open space could include 100% stormwater or all of the floodplain or those remnant pieces of the property that nobody really wanted. So in talking with staff, we were like, how satisfied are you with that? And it was pretty unanimous. We don't. So what we started doing is looking at a couple of different things. We looked at places that we've worked in as well as some of the other communities and said, well, what's a good model to kind of look at? So we came up with a tiered approach. So in section 8.8, from a residential standpoint, we break it up into 50 acres or less, 50 acres or more from a residential standpoint. And then we also have non-residential open space requirements as well as our mixed use. And there are different thresholds, different things that, for a community of this size, you need to have a specific type of park. And we define what a small, medium, and large park are. It's from an overall size, as well as the types of amenities and facilities to kind of pull from in a buffet list. The thing that we also said was you can't have all of your open space as stormwater. You can have portions of it. We're not going to penalize you for that. But at the same time, we want some usable open space for that portion of the community, or that portion of the city. It's done in a lot of other places. So we don't want to sit there and say that this is draconian by any means. This is, good planning, it's good design, and it's good from a healthy community's perspective as well. Section 10, nonconformities. We're going to just kind of go through this briefly, but once we go from an existing UDO and zoning to something new, we're always going to have non-conforming uses. So those items that are grandfathered in, the understanding is that, that use that's legally there now, it can continue to do exactly what they're doing without, repercussions or having to do something new. But there's a period of time, or if they come in and change, then the new standards kick in at that point. So we want to make sure that there are those types of provisions, and actually we're required to make sure we have those provisions. So just because you adopt a new UDO doesn't mean that the building across the street is going to have to conform today to those standards. If they were to tear down the building and come in with something new or make significant modifications, then the new standards come into play. And then the last section we have is the definitions and terms. So, definitions were previously kind of scattered throughout the UDO. You may say, well, Kelly, you've already talked about use standards and use definitions. So there's two types of things that we're talking about. There's the definitions that we have up in section 7, which talk about the drive-throughs and we'll say funeral homes or whatever else, or banks. Those use type definitions. These are the terms generally used throughout the UDO. So this is, as we're talking about here, canopies or parapets, access, those things that are generally defined throughout the UDO, not specific to a specific type of use. So we actually have kind of two things. And, this is one of those, as we always talk about, this is probably the last section that actually gets done after we get the UDO updated for the most part, because we start trying to define things at the very beginning, and these things always get changed. So, we get the baseline, we get everything up, input, but we understand there's probably gonna be some changes to this section as well. So that is it for the UDO. I know we're going to be talking about the zoning map, so I want to take a quick moment. Is there any questions about the UDO before we move forward? Harry, anybody need a break? Anybody need to do? Everybody still awake?
Question,
Yes, ma'am.
is there any area that's rural still within the city limits?
This is rural.
Yeah.
There is not a quote unquote defined rural district. It is the rural land use district, which is that 2 dwelling units per acre. So, what was an R40 is now similar akin to an R20. But you did not have we'll say an agricultural or a rural residential component in there to begin with.
So why is there no clustering options in rural and low density areas?
I'm sorry.
Why is there no clustering in the low and rural density areas?
That was a discussion that we had with staff, and I'm not going to put Lisa on the spot. I think, one of the things that we were concerned about was in those areas, just maintaining the feel of a more low density. When you start to get into medium and higher density, you can start getting more open spaces and more trade-offs. Good questions.
I
Yes,
got one. When you're talking about basically taking R40 and R20 and making it RLD. So in effect, what we're doing is we're reducing the density because R40 is basically 1 unit an acre.
Correct.
So that standard goes away and everything becomes 2 units per acre.
Up to a maximum of 2, yes, sir.
Right. So you've basically taken away kind of our rural area feel in some of the areas where the surrounding homes set on 1 or more acres, and you go in and now you're allowing them to put 2 homes in the middle of a residence area that are single homes.
So here is where I'm going to get up on a little bit of a soapbox. A city really should not have agricultural rural zoning, especially in a major market or a developing area, metro area such as this. At least somebody want to kick me for saying something like this, but it's an inefficient use of land in our opinion. Yes, I know there's those property owners that have the 1 and 5 acres. But what you're going to start to see is most of those folks are the very ones that want to do something more because they do have 2 kids or 3 kids. I was Lisa's counterpart in horse country in Georgetown, Kentucky. And, it was 2 dwelling units minimum of 2, maximum of 2 dwelling in some areas. And without having a agricultural component, unless it was in the country, in the rural lands. There again, it was an inefficient use of the land. If you're having to provide services, and this is a discussion that I had with Freddie earlier, you're paying more, so the return on an investment from the city's perspective, police, fire, water, wastewater, whatever, is you extend it or expand it. I know it's a quality of life issue versus a land use and a monetary discussion.
I can agree with that, but the point also remains that we have developers coming forward with wanting to put in new developments where they take a big bag of 800 acres and they say, okay, we want to build 2.5 homes per acre, but when you start slicing out everything and they put the actual homes on there, they're cracker boxes. And we're asking people to pay $500,000 for a cracker box, which some people won't do. And we're discouraging people who want to come in here and build a large family home and have a backyard and a front yard and a driveway and a rear loading garage. They don't have the room for it. So by setting this standard, you're taking our ability to look at these developments and ask for some larger homes so we can attract more different diversity of people into our neighborhood. And then instead, what we wind up with is we give the developer a tool to come in and build cracker boxes.
So
They might give you a couple of homes on this side because the math works out for them. But on this side, they're putting everybody in 750 square foot timber boxes.
So here's two things I'm gonna throw out to you. One, you still have the ability from a property owner to do one house on 5 acres. We've not said that you've got to do anything other than what you're doing right now. We're giving you the ability, if you did want to sell your land, that 800 acres. And I always get into discussion with, a lot of the folks that are selling that land, that's their 401k. And I know some people go, well, they chose that for a reason, but there's nothing in the code that says thou shalt develop at 2 dwelling units per acre. You or anybody, any other developer, I keep saying you, not saying you general, but you in general could come in and do a large lot estate subdivision if that's what the market, and that's what your market is. There's nothing in there here that says thou shalt do 10,000 square foot lots in this RLD. We're giving you the option to do that. We're still saying it's still a maximum of 2 dwelling units per acre. We're not saying it's 2.5 or anything else. To go to 2.5, you've got to go to a different district. Most of the land that is zoned within the city is, when we did the analysis, was actually, majority of it was R20 right now. And the majority that we're proposing retains that, what we're calling that residential low density. So there again, I mean, it's an option. We don't recommend in an urban community having 1 dwelling unit per acre, but there again, that is up to the combined boards as far as the recommendation and the approval.
My point is, if we take that R40 away, we've taken the tool away, then we have no say so any longer.
You sure make it sound like it's easier to put in cracker box neighborhoods.
Well, and I know we talk about cracker box, of course, I will say, and I'm going to look at Majib as well. The state basically says, you can't regulate what the house looks like, especially with 1 and 2 family dwelling. That's something that Lisa and I've had this discussion about. 2 dwelling units per acre is still a very low density. And when I say very low density, I'm not saying that we need to be like Charlotte by any means. To the contrary. But there are other areas that, have, and Lisa, I think you may have some additional information as far as where you all were tracking compared to some of the other communities around the state of a similar size.
Yeah, and if you, some of you may recall, and I believe it was presented to City Council, May in 2020, we had a whole strategic session on residential growth. And what we looked at was some of the state statutes that, took away some of our abilities to regulate exterior materials for 1 and 2 family dwellings. State statute has now taken away our ability to regulate the square feet of a house. We also discussed how the city compared in our growth to the other municipalities within our county. I think there's 14 municipalities within the county, and our growth percentage was like 8%, and we were number 11 in growth. We talked about how our densities compared to other municipalities that were similar in size of our population. And what we are proposing is comparable to what some of the other municipalities, Indian Trail, Mooresville, Wake Forest, Matthews, Waxhaw. So what the density is being proposed is similar to what our surrounding municipalities are proposing as well. So we did have that, that presentation. I'll be happy to send that to everyone again. But and then we have looked at the densities that are being proposed within the zoning districts. And if you recall, they kind of go hand in hand with the character areas that were established and identified within the future land use plan. I mean, the future land use plan, which was a community-driven process, established where we wanted to grow and how we wanted to grow. and it did have a vision for different densities. So this kind of serves to implement that land use vision that was identified in 2018 and adopted.
Lisa, do you know who from the General Assembly standpoint, who's the primary architect of most of this legislation that's kind of cutting us off at the knees?
Well, it's not, that's not necessarily fair to say that there's one. You have to remember that a lot of these changes have been in 160B. And it's not just one individual in the General Assembly.
Well, I understand
It's
that.
not- let me finish. It's multiple individuals in the General Assembly. Because what happens is they see a problem or they're told by a person in their district, well, the city or this place wouldn't let me do this. So, or told me I had to do this. So lo and behold, we get a piece of legislation that says, city shall not. And then another issue comes up, and then another representative in the General Assembly, either the House or the Senate side, said, well, I don't like that, so guess what, city? You can't do that either. So there's a lot of folks. And then we do have some that, when we're looking at inspections, in particular, building inspections and those issues, there are certain members that are leading that, but that's not, I think, the question you asked. So it's not fair to say a member. There's a lot of members. There's an on occasion, we do see an view of what we do in terms of regulating land use and development. So if you want to blame anyone, blame the home builders and the developers who provide contributions to members of the General Assembly.
I know, but I'm just trying to figure out if I wanted to send an email to somebody, if there was somebody that had influence over everybody else that seems to be leading the charge.
I don't know if it's fair to say there's someone leading the charge so much as, if you want to send it and actually have an impact, send it to members of our local delegation. Some of them are involved and many of them have influence and some not necessarily. Now, you could always send it to all the members of the General Assembly.
And just to kind of, let me add on to what Majid was saying, and I definitely appreciate that perspective and that information, Majid. You're not the only state that deals with this. There are a lot of states out there that you cannot regulate 1 and 2 family dwellings. You cannot regulate architectural designs outside of a historic district. There are certain states that say that if you as a community do not process a specific application within this time frame, it is deemed approved. Period.
Negative.
Whether or not it meets the code or not. So Majid is 110% correct on problem, statute. And there's some interesting ones. I'm not gonna say crazy, but there's some interesting reading out there with various states that when we start talking about that. Let me go back to something very quickly, because this is your current zoning map as it stands right now. The gray area is your current R20. The smaller tan areas along the northern bounds or the northern extremes of the city, that is the R40. And kind of building off of what Lisa said, the areas that we've identified as going from, we'll say, the R40 to, that 2 dwelling units an acre are those areas right there. And that's in those areas where we've actually also identified, because the expressway was, of course, coming through at that time, with the mixed use activity centers, which do have 5, 6, whatever, they're supposed to be a mix of uses. They're supposed to be a higher density or intensity type of project. And you really don't want a 1 per acre development right next to something like that. So there again, we're talking about that limited area. That would be the area that's subject to going from 1 dwelling unit per acre to 2. Everything that's gray right now is up to 2 dwelling units per acre. That's that R20. So I just want to make sure we're all looking at that.
That's in the current.
The current, yes, sir. Yeah, this is what's adopted as of today.
So all the gray is R20 low density residential, and that is what has been converted to the RLD, the residential low density, and it's what's being proposed. So a majority of the city zoning, as far as the residential low density R20, is really not changing.
And I apologize, I do not have those percentages. Helen, if you can make a note that we'll get that, the amount of acreage it's actually converting. We'll have that to Lisa probably either end of this week or first of next week, just so you can kind of see how much acreage we're playing with each category.
Explain please the difference in existing R10 and the RLD as far as the density doesn't change at all.
The RLD is still 2 dwelling units an acre. The R10 is basically, it's a 4 dwelling unit per acre. And I thought, if I'm not mistaken, that the R10 went to the RMD.
You're correct.
Okay. Trying to find my cheat sheet.
Slide 21.
Slide 21, thank you. And for those of you who have them, I know we did some handouts that went along with the zoning map discussions, the kind of the bifold pullouts for both the mixed use as well as traditional, just so you could kind of see the comparison of both the densities as well as the development standards, so setbacks, heights and things like that. That's a really good piece of information for you to kind of look at. Besides, take the list, but look at those fold outs. Does everybody have that, Lisa?
They received them in
It
their
was in our
hard
packet.
copy
Yes.
packet in the mail, and it's located online.
So that'll actually kind of give you that quick snapshot of before and after, all the way through on the densities and design standards. So, yeah, that R10, which was defined as high density, is now the residential medium. And then what was RMF and, the RMF, which was the residential multifamily, is considered high density based off of the proposed standards. There again, the densities are about the same.
That's what I was asking, because I'm looking at the yellow, there's a whole lot of yellow. I want to know what we're being asked to approve here. That's a lot of area.
I'm sorry, can you say that one more
I
time?
said, that's a lot of area. I need to know what I'm being asked to approve. Here.
So-
Like you're changing, looks like on my map.
We're changing the color, but we're not changing the standards. So the density is still the same, the setbacks are still the same. We're just going from what was considered R20 or called R20 to a residential low, which is still 2 dwelling units per acre, and kind of in there again, if you've got that cheat sheet, that'll help. But yeah, we are changing colors, and I know that gets a little confusing. What we notice a lot of times is gray is more typically associated with industrial zoning on everybody else's map. So the first time we saw that, it was like, wow, you've got this much industrial? And she's like, no, no, it's residence. That's the R40, or excuse me, R20 areas. It's like, okay. So that was another reason we started to kind of morph some of the colorations around.
Probably also worth mentioning that if you're worried about, the kind of cookie cutter or Parker housing, that there's gonna be a conditional zoning process or a planned district process where the city is still gonna have a say in it, so the tool won't really be taken away. What this is really referring to is the by right zoning that is allowed, and that's a different process. The chances that a huge developer is gonna come in and develop a big subdivision by right using the R20 is, I haven't seen it very often.
And we
at all.
haven't seen it in the city in, I would pretty fair to say, at least 7 years, and probably more.
Excellent point. Thank you very much, Nick. Yeah, so how many different municipalities do you work around?
Tons.
More than you have on your hands, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Yeah, most of your large scale developers, one, they're a little bit more savvy, they're a little bit more adept at what they're doing. And, they are definitely not using thank you very much. They're going to be looking more at that conditional district. They're going to be looking at some of those other differences because of the variations and things that they need. Otherwise, they would be asking for a lot of variances to standards. Whereas they can negotiate with the city as part of the conditional district. Thank you for that. Thank you very much. Okay, Mayor, I know we're getting close on time. So the zoning map, like I said, the proposed, it looks very different, but when you actually start comparing apples to apples, you'll realize it's not a very big difference other than, I'll say for the most part, it is the mixed use areas that were called out by Forward Monroe and some of the changes in that. Within the map series, we did identify, we broke it out by the layer. So we took the major, the entire map, and then we broke it out. We took it like the cake layers, because you try to look at this, especially at this scale, and it's like, I have no clue where half of these things are. So in your graphics, in your map series, and Lisa has all of this as well, you know, we've identified exactly where is the low density, where is the medium. And so each of the districts is identified, and there again, the scale is a little deceiving. You may go, did you do anything? But believe it or not, there are properties that are colored a certain way on each of these layers. And we even have done that same thing for the mixed use areas. Oh, that's one of the things we wanted to make sure that the Concord Avenue overlay, that was one of those that staff said, please don't touch. So we didn't. You know, one that's actually a really good plan. It's a great overlay. There's, I'll say, a lot of buy-in on that plan. So that was another one of those. It's like, we didn't morph that one for a couple of different reasons. We thought that was actually a really good approach in this area. And in the quadrant map, just so what we did was just broke it up so it's a little bit easier to see with a little bit more detail. So what are our next steps? Well, we're hoping that we get a positive recommendation tonight from the planning board so that the council can hear this officially at its next hearing on September the 14th. We do realize there's probably a little bit more cleanup that we need to do, some final things with the legal staff. So Lisa, if it's within the right for me to say is, you know, we would be asking for approval while we modify minor terms and or some of the language that we have in here and continue to move forward. Lisa?
Are there any other questions about the UDO or the proposed zoning map or districts or anything that you want to go back to? I know y'all's next meeting's at 6, so you have about 45 minutes until that meeting. So just want to make sure aren't any other questions or comments that y'all might have out.
One question, why are the minimum lot size so large for clustering subdivisions?
So large?
For a cluster subdivision, the minimum lot size is 5,000 square feet.
Okay.
So basically what this is in here, and say a developer wants to come in and do a development that is in a residential medium density. And they could either develop it by right and have 12,000 square foot lots at 3 units per acre, or if they do certain incentives within that's outlined in our ordinance. So say if they do want to do a cluster subdivision where the lot sizes are a little smaller, they preserve more open space, they could get an increased density of 4 units per acre. But the optional caveat is they do have to sign a waiver affidavit that they would adhere to our residential design standards. Because as we mentioned before, you know, for by right subdivisions, you know, we can no longer require 1 to 2 family dwellings, do certain exterior materials, but if they wanted to do the cluster option, then they can incentivize their projects and do residential design standards. But the cluster lot size is the 5,000, not 12,000.
If I can just ask a quick clarification, are you reading that where it's got to be a minimum of 5 acres? Is that the reference to the lot size?
Yeah.
Okay, so basically what we're saying is in order to be able to even do a cluster, it's got to be at least 5 acres. It can't be half an acre and start kind of doing that. So, sorry.
Lisa, do we have a minimum lot width? I'm sorry, what was the question? They said
Minimum.
Yeah,
lot
each
width.
district still has specific lot widths that are identified, like the residential low density, which converted the R40, R20. Sorry, I forget to take it off. That converted the R40, R20 to the residential low density, that minimum lot width is 100 feet. For the residential 10,000 square foot zoning district that is being proposed to go to the residential medium density is a minimum of 75 feet lot width. And this is for by right subdivision. So of course, if the developer chooses to go through the conditional district site-specific rezoning, they can request to deviate from these standards.
Is there high density?
The residential high density district, which basically converted our residential multifamily district to, we have very little of that district, but their minimum lot width is 70 feet.
And in clustering, is there a minimum lot width?
Okay.
So under the cluster,
What I'm getting at is all the 50-foot lots we get.
so here, under the cluster, you can have anywhere, and we've defined 5 housing types. So as part of a cluster, you have to have at least 3 of the 5 housing types. You can't have all 50-foot wide lots. And we also put it in there to where it is, 3 housing types, whether it's 20,000 square feet or greater, 10 to 20, 7,500, or 5,000. But that you have to have at least no more than 60% of any one housing type. So you could, and if you're going to do this, the smallest lots, they cannot be more than 20% of the total, and they have to be internal. They cannot be along the perimeter of the site. So we've put in additional safeguards as far as clustered, but you have to do these extra steps. So that's part of the trade-off.
We don't have a minimum lot width in cluster development.
It depends on the lot, on the housing type. If you can look at section 4 of your code, page 9. I'll show you.
They don't have the
I'll
entire
hold my
code.
breath.
Oh, okay.
So what I've showed her is, if anybody wants to write this down, on section 4, page 9, under the cluster, there's a table. It's talking about the cluster standards, and it said that 5 housing types are defined by lot size, lot width, and then any placement requirements. So it's talking about where, what size lots those are, what's the maximum percentage of a certain type, where if they have to be internal or can they be along the periphery. It also talks about additional buffering standards. So from a clustering perspective, we've tried to make sure that it's not just you're clustering and it's all the 50-foot wide lots. That was a concern that staff did bring up to us.
I want to be able to go back.
Yeah, but we're just getting so many.
Yeah.
Yes.
I got here a little early. I had a discussion with Kelly. And basically what he's telling you is this. Your questions, your concerns that you have on planning board, which does come to the council, were addressed in 2018 and 2020. And if we want to go back and make any changes to that now, it's taking us back to 2018 or 2020, which means you're not going to have this approved by January 1st when the state legislature. Is that correct? Mr. Shawcott?
Yes, sir.
I hate to drive a nail in this thing now, but I just want to be honest with these people that they know, the position we're in.
So that being said, the planning board would like to make a motion to recommend the adoption of the resolution approving land development compliance.
Motion, do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. Renee. We have a motion and a second. All those in favor, raise your hand. Thank you. Any opposed, please raise your hand.
It was unanimous.
Motion carries.
Since that motion carried, I'd like to make a motion to recommend the adoption of the ordinance amending chapter 157, establish new unified development ordinance for UDO and official zoning map.
We have a motion. Do we have a second? Rich, second. We have a motion and a second. All those in favor, raise your hand. Any opposed, raise your hand. Motion carries.
Thank you for the presentation.
Thank you all very much, and thank you for your patience.
We are. Thank everyone. We
All right,
appreciate
I'd
it.
like to thank the planning board. For coming together with the council. I think we had a very productive meeting. Lisa, thank you and staff for all the work you folks do. This is not easy to set up. I know there's a lot of work in it. I want to thank you, the staff and ladies over here, keeping us straight. Doing a good job for us. Well, thank you again, planning board, and it's just time to have a motion to adjourn. Make a motion to adjourn. Have a motion, have a second.
Second.
All in favor? Any opposed? Hearing none, we adjourn.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.
I make a motion to adjourn.
Rich made a motion.
Second.
Do we have a motion and a second?
Sorry.
Yeah, I got that.